Hi, I'm Liz, and I'm a nail tech and artist, and I'm here to talk about my painting, The Swan. The Swan is a current work in progress, and it's a test for a final painting, which will incorporate impasto. This is a technique I have never used, and I'm excited to test out my impasto mediums that I've purchased. The painting itself is on Clairefontaine oil paper, and I've not used this paper before, so this is a whole new experience for me. And I thought it was wise to play with the technique of impasto to figure out what was possible with it before I committed to the final surface. Impasto can be described as the layering of paint thickly onto a surface, and this allows the creation of texture and kind of a 3D effect. And impasto mediums kind of thicken a paint so that excess paint isn't wasted, so it can be more economical to the artist. And they're usually a mixture of beeswax, turpentine and linseed oil, but it really depends on what brand and what you're using paint wise, to what you should be using as a medium basically. The three colours I used for this underpainting are Michael Harding's Prussian Blue, Ivory Black and Smick Mussini's Titanium White. A great palette tip is to keep white as clean as possible, because it will pick up the smallest amount of colour that it touches, and that will contaminate any future mixes you decide to create with it. Another great tip for painting is, if you are mixing a colour to go over a large area, be sure to mix enough to cover that area, as I learnt later on, it can be quite difficult to remix the colour. I tend to trace my preliminary sketches onto the background or canvas or panel that I am going to be putting my final piece onto, rather than paint directly onto a preliminary sketch, because this way you have, or I have, the preliminary sketch which is full detail, which they can be, for me anyway, they can be quite detailed. And if I was to paint directly onto it, all that detail would be lost and forgotten under paint, which can actually happen with the tracing. But if you have what you've drawn, your original idea in front of you, it's easier just to paint in the detail and remember what you wanted it to look like. So the underpainting, the colour is mixed with zested solvent to thin it, and this makes the paint go further. And secondly, it is the first step in the fat to lean process, where the underlayers contain more solvent and the upper layers more oil, which aids in preventing the painting from cracking in years to come. Also, the underpainting after drying can potentially alter the upper layers of paint that are put on afterwards, depending on how translucent they are, which allows the creation of shadows and depth. So why is the underpainting grey? Well, my idea is to paint the swan's feathers in impasto. and attempt to recreate the feathers textures with paint. And this might involve scratching back to the underpainting, which would act as a shadow. I'm not entirely sure this will work because I suspect I should have made the underpainting more 3D, so adding more detail to the feathers using shadow, but we'll find out. This is a totally new experience in painting for me. I could end up with a slightly light grey swan, or have the idea that I've got in my head actually come out on canvas, but we'll find out. All art is a journey, and about 80% of the time it's about getting yourself out of trouble. And a lot of it is kind of understanding what you're actually using and putting the time into playing with it, which is why this test piece exists. Another tip about brushes is to take care of them. These two brushes I kind of wrecked. I was using them in a place I couldn't clean them, so I added linseed oil to them to transport them home. And linseed oil can be used to prolong the wetness of oil paint. However, if you use this technique, I highly recommend getting to them quickly. Whatever you use it for, if it's to prolong paint or to keep your brush wet, get to it quickly, because it does set. And this is what happened to me, and so I'm trying to see if I can save these brushes, or if I've saved them. I've cleaned them with solvent and a special artist's brush paint. I mean soap. But to be honest, don't think it's really working or worked, because it's like painting with, say you're in a supermarket and you're pushing a trolley with a wonky wheel. It's a bit like painting with that. They've got a life of their own, and trying to keep them in a line. I mean, I'm used to painting with weird brushes anyway, because when you're at school or you're young, you don't tend to spend a lot on brushes, and you just use what you're given, so you end up trying to paint within the line with a brush that has a mind of its own. But yeah, it's trying to stay within a line. It's a nightmare. But yeah, I think these brushes are not well at all, and I won't be using them again. About halfway through the underpainting process, my grey-blue mix started to run out, and I was adding more solvent to it, which resulting in a thinner sort of a wash of colour. To be honest, I'm not sure if it's meant to be washy or thick like I did the body of, or more opaque like I did the body of the swan. But this is an experiment, so we'll see how it goes. So people are probably wondering why I'm wearing gloves. I use a lot of chemicals in my day job, and the best way to protect yourself from chemicals is to wear gloves. And paints are chemicals, solvents are chemicals, and you can overexpose yourself to them and become sensitive. And I don't particularly want to become allergic to my job. But also it's good to remember that some oil paints are toxic. Depending on which ones you buy, they can contain lead, cadmium, all sorts of things, and they usually have warning labels on them. I don't think any of the ones I'm using have anything nasty in them, so far as I've gone in this painting so far. but it does involve solvent, and I'm better safe than sorry. Also, I'm one of those ones that gets covered in pretty much anything they use, from accidentally getting a spot on some clothing to getting your hands covered. So just day in, day out, if I'm doing nails or I'm painting, I'll just take the extra step to make sure I'm safe. So yeah, if you feel you need to protect yourself, don't be afraid to. Everything I've used I will put in the description box, for the paints and where I got them. But I find Michael Harding oil paints are pretty good. My only concern with this Sminke titanium white is that it contains zinc, and zinc has been known to make paint films brittle. When I was last looking into oil paints in a big way, which is 5 years ago, there was a big thing about conservers saying zinc white was making paint films brittle. And when you're trying to be archival and keep your painting as crack free as possible for as long as possible, a brittle paint film is not what you need. However, zinc to titanium white ratios or mixes of any pigment, I think, I'm not an expert, there's a certain percentage of zinc white in a paint that will counteract the brittleness. However, a lot of artists are turning their back on zinc white as a colour, which is causing a few paint brands to find other alternative whites, and create whites, I suppose, that don't have zinc in them, which 5 years from my research to finding this was quite incredible. You can see that halfway through my painting of the feathers, I ran out of colour, which is why I say make enough for large areas. Even if it's not an underpainting, make sure you've got enough, because trying to remix a colour is very difficult to the exact colour that you've had. And I would always recommend writing down what colours have been used in a painting so that you've got a reference, or at least take a photo of your palette with the colours next to them, so that you the paint tubes next to them, so you know what you've got. I somehow managed to get it to be very similar to what I had, and I painted over trying to keep it consistent, one consistent block colour. I've kept the outline of the feathers as a guide for later on, but technically I think it should all be one flat colour. So my idea of giving the impasto an underpainting not only would hopefully allow me to create depth of colour, as I've explained, but also to do it in a mostly solvent based layer would allow it to potentially not crack. I have two impasto mediums. One is Zestit's impasto medium, and the other one is C. Robertson's impasto medium, and they both contain beeswax. This painting will be Zestit based, I think, because I'm also planning to use one of their other normal mediums around with the parts that aren't impasto. As I said, this is an experiment, and I highly recommend playing around with things to get an idea of how they work. The fat to lean method of painting is my go-to method of painting, and I've incorporated a bit of this into how I'm doing this painting. I actually researched impasto painting, but it's very hard to find information about it. Apparently the fat to lean method doesn't apply, and I've looked in books, but the most interesting information I found was on the Jackson's art blog, and I'll put the articles in the description box below. Painting for me can be very therapeutic, and it can be very hard to start something new or continue something, but once you're actually there, it just, well, for me it flows. It's kind of like a meditation, really. The only drawback of oil paints is their greatest asset, which is they don't dry fast. You get time to play with it. If you've ever experienced acrylics and found how hard or fast they dry and how hard they are to manipulate, yeah, oil paint for me wins hands down. So the next step for me was to mix Michael Harding's ultramarine, which is not the actual lapis lazuli ultramarine, but their ultramarine with more zested solvent to create the underpainting for the surrounds, which I intend to do a kind of watery effect. I'm kind of really into blue at the moment, which you could probably tell from the sets of nails I've been posting to Instagram, and night skies and things like that I'm very into at the moment. And I was initially just going to do 2 sections of it, of the surrounds around the swan, so that I could just test a fading white idea into the blue. However, which is like me, I changed my mind and decided to paint the whole thing in case I decided to come back to it once my test had finished and the main painting had finished. I might add to it. I might not. If it depends if it works, but I have enough painting to play with. I think there's a general idea. And even now, it's probably about a week or so later since I've painted this blue background, and it's still wet. So, while the actual inside, the swan, is dry, which is probably more to do with what pigments are in the paints than anything, or, well, yeah, actually, solvent does evaporate. So yeah, I think, so something else to remember is pigments have their own characteristics, even if they're ground into paint, into oils to create paints. They will dry probably at different times. So there's a lot of different things to painting, but yeah, it's all the fun, is learning everything. But at the moment it seems this particular paint, ultramarine, takes longer to dry. But yeah, we'll see. It's a pretty nice colour. And I'm still using the dodgy brushes. Well, I'm quite glad my camera seems to have calmed down and is actually focused on what it's meant to be focused on. And I've just realised that isn't a dodgy brush, that's a watercolour brush that I've had. Oh no, this is a dodgy brush. The other brush was a watercolour brush that I just picked up and forgot, because I haven't painted in a long time, that I actually have separate watercolour brushes. And it did make me wonder why this brush had a mind of its own and was very flimsy. And turned out I was trying to use a, I suppose a natural haired brush that It was okay, kind of, because this oil paint, well, it was mostly solvent, so it was kind of ink sort of thickness, which probably has saved the brush from a nasty death of oil. But it was so flimsy. When I was painting, I wasn't entirely sure what was going on, and then I realised I picked up totally the wrong brush for what I wanted it for. Yeah, so it's probably why I've switched to a dodgy brush, which actually is holding its own a little bit, but I do find hog hair brushes are a bit scratchy anyway, and they kind of, and the camera's going weird, they kind of, you can't paint a clean line with them. Unless, of course, I'm blaming all of this on the fact that my brushes are not well and I've not experienced a decent, not messed up hog hair brush for a while, so we'll see. I have some synthetic mongoose brushes I bought about 5 years ago, which are a lot, they're kind of as stiff as a hog hair but soft. It's kind of strange to describe, but they are. I do want to try them out, so they might be the way to go. And I do have some healthy brushes that I will test out. Yeah. So I decided to leave this bit, this amount of blue, and then this bit is the cut to where I decided to, I think a day later, continue the underpainting all over the paper. Again, I think I should have added some more sort of shadowing, or at least made a divide between water and sky, but at this point I think all I've got in my head is that I'm going to blend out the swan, possibly have a ripple effect, not entirely certain. I would highly recommend using a larger brush if you're doing a large area. This brush is the same brush I've been using all throughout, and it you can see it's not holding paint, and it's a bit of a struggle to cover the paper. I'm using wide streaks or strokes of the brush, and I'm blending as I'm going so that you don't get too much of a streaky effect. You could, if you wanted movement in your underpainting, you could use a streaky effect, I suppose, which would translate upwards through your paint layers, should you wanted to do that. Yeah, there's a lot you can do with an underpainting. And it acts as quite a nice guide as well. If you add the shadows in the right place, you get a nice guide. To your painting. Did a lot of cutting here because I'm painting off camera, because the paper is actually bigger than what is on the screen. But yeah. Yeah, I do like this blue, I've said this before. I suppose absorbency or drying could also be affected by the paper, but you would think it would be faster because it's paper. However, it's oil paper. But yeah, I actually will be filming the next part, which once the paper's dry or the paint's dry, and that will be probably doing the beak, and I might just paint straight onto it, I'm not certain yet. And I will try my impasto idea. I'm hoping titanium white is opaque. It usually is quite opaque, but I'm going to be trying it with this Sminker titanium white, which might be translucent. Again, this whole process is me relearning what I knew probably 5 years ago and getting an idea of the paints. I've never used Prussian blue before either, and it's quite nice. I'm hoping the shadowing works out. In the actual reference photos, this sort of greyish blue is present in the shadows, and I'm hoping it translates to the sculptural effect, but we will find out. And I'll find out how easy it is to manipulate impasto paints, because it's just totally alien to me. I usually paint kind of with a perfectionist eye, where I want it to be realistic. So for me to try and create something with a texture which is technically kind of more simplistic, more impressionist, it's a bit hard to get my head around. But I'm thinking at the moment I've got this idea of making it realistic with impasto, and I have a feeling it's going to go wrong, or it's not going to be as I think it's going to be. It's either going to end up that I can sculpt it quite easily into what I want, or it's just literally going to end up in streaks of thick paint. Either way, it's going to be an interesting idea. Let's see what happens. Everything's unknown at the moment. Nearly there with the background, all the underpainting. Yeah, it's quite an interesting technique, and utilising an underpainting. I'm not really doing it correctly, but it's given me a guide of what I can do, or where everything's going, I suppose, for me at the moment. And also, I've got a base which is all dried at the same time. Although, to be honest, being on paper, it's not quite as permanent, probably, as I would like it to be, unless it's placed in a frame. But yeah, probably the most archival ground or panel is aluminium, I think, because it doesn't react to temperature as much as a wood panel would, or moisture really. Temperature, I reckon it would, but it would depend on its expansion. I don't know what you would call it, ratio? How much you would expand, because that would affect what was on it. But yeah, aluminium seems to be the way to go with making things more permanent. It's funny how technology moves forward and you get all sorts of new techniques and paints and ways of painting coming through, especially with nails. Nails is quickly growing into just incredible net art can be made on nails now, which is why I went into it. Incidentally, I did a post on my Instagram about oil paint brushes, I think, and well, as I've explained, these had a slight accident that involved me, but I did do a post about it on Instagram with a black and white photo of them in solvent. Just might be an interesting read. You can see I got a little bit frustrated with the paint there, where it wasn't spreading, but I got it to spread thinly. See, this is the part that I've tested and it's still wet, so it could be why, because it might have sunk into the paper a bit. There is a lot to painting if you want to get a final result that you want at the end of it. I mean, it's the same with anything. You can do nails, you can do I imagine dentistry or something like that, and depending on how far you research, how far down the rabbit hole you want to go, you're constantly learning. Even if you've been doing something for years, you can be constantly learning. It just depends how far you want to push yourself, and you can stay at a certain level, or you can just keep going and improving and trying to be the best you can be, or to make your art or whatever you're doing the best you can be. And I have a tendency to research everything about a subject to fully understand where it's going, well, for me, nails, nail art, structure. If I go on nails, with art, you can just there's so many different types of techniques, so many different ways of doing a painting, from realistic to impressionist to cubist to abstract to just, yeah. You have to discover your style and just keep going with it. I hope you have enjoyed my commentary on my swan painting, and I hope to see you next time. Thanks for watching. Bye.